Oh, what happened? There it is.
Oh, now we're getting
Well, hello. You know the universal greeting of the JAMAR Nicholas Network. Well, hello, and welcome back to Pencil, your favorite pandemic podcast, brought to you weekly, Wednesdays, 8 p.m. EST. I hope all of you are well. Thank you for joining us again. My name is JAMAR Nicholas, scholastic author, illustrator of Leon the Extraordinary. Soon to see the next book in the series, Leon the Magnificent, coming to stores next year. We're not at pre-orders yet, but I'll let you know as soon as that happens. I'm very happy to be joined.
Stand in the store. Just go stand in the store and wait.
That's right. We're going to start it all over again, guys.
Is it here yet? Is it here yet?
Is it here yet? Is it here yet? It's like Christmas Eve all over again. Did you guys, when you were younger, did you ever have problems sleeping Christmas Eve when you're a little one? Like, oh, I can't wait to wake up and see whatever happens in the morning. No.
Yeah, for sure.
No.
I mean, I remember when I learned that there was no Santa Claus.
Oh, Mike! Spoiler alert! Spoiler alert! Spoiler alert!
For all the 3-year-olds watching our podcast.
What a weird way for them to find out.
I know, right? I was about to listen about layouts, and then I found out there's no Santa. Let me introduce my co-host. You know him, and we just had WrestleMania, the World Heavyweight Champion, retaining and still World Heavyweight Champion of webcomics, Stone Cold Steve Conley. Well, hello, Steve Conley. How are you, sir?
Well, hello, gentlemen. Good to see you. Very good to see you.
Steve, what's new in the Steveverse?
I am doing educational comics. I mentioned before, Rick Veach and I do a lot of educational comics together, and I am up to my gills in a project for a big project. It's great. You'll never see it unless you're like a sixth graders might see it next year.
I did a series of graphic novels, just kind of like you, Steve. Wasn't Mike maybe 5 or 6 graphic novels that I don't think I've seen. And I had this contract for a medical consortium, and I drew a bunch of graphic novels about substance abuse.
Wow.
And it went in they printed it and went right into counselors' offices. I didn't even get any. So I don't even know.
They never sent you copies?
I have no idea what that job looked like. All 6 of them.
You gotta have an addiction to get a copy.
Yeah. So one of the doctors said, the only way you're going to see this is if you're wind up in a counselor's office. I was like, well, I think there's easier ways to get comps, but thanks for that.
As a real fan, I'm going to start using.
Y'all got any of those JAMAR Nicholas graphic novels? That's not nice. And I would be remiss, ladies and gentlemen, if I did not introduce the maestro of mark making, the Monsignor of markers. I don't know. That's a good one. Monsignor of markers, the Fulbright Colonel of comic book illustration, Michael Manley. Hello, Mike Manley. How are you, sir?
Hello, everyone.
Well, hello.
I do have a marker right here.
Yeah, look at that.
Maybe we should have that, like epaulets made of markers.
I hang it down a bunch of.
My Captain Crunch markers hanging off.
Who was that? Commander Mark? Was that the?
Yeah, Commander Mark Kistler's draw squad.
He would have like the little arm, like markers running down his arm, like
a bandolier strap.
Was it really? Oh, that's
like
great.
Chewbacca. Yeah, he had crayons in it.
Excellent.
Guys, do you think I would make a good drawing TV show kids segment host? Do you think I could do that?
I'm surprised you're not already.
Really? Hey,
yeah, you'd be great. You would be fantastic.
But you know what would make it really sell is if you had a big foam version of yourself that you were inside.
Oh, like I was inside myself.
You're inside yourself, right? Like a cartoon version of you, but you were inside of it.
Malkovich. I like it. I think you're onto something. So, you know what? Also, for some of you who may not know the origin of this live stream / podcast, this is an offshoot and a sister project of Mike Manley, our dear editor-in-chief of Draw! Magazine, published by Tomorrow's Publishing. Where Mike, you were doing that. We never say never. The magazine's been around since when? 2000.
2001, yeah.
Wow, that's magnificent. And during that time, I've been fortunate enough to be a columnist. I've interviewed several people on there. Some of my favorite ones were Brian Lee O'Malley, back before the Scott Pilgrim movie came out. We're just talking about the manga. And you did a good one with Kyle Baker, I remember. Right. And then at some point, I took over for Andy Parks. It became the Krusty Critic, reviewing tools and techniques to save you money. And guys, I can't stop. The Krusty Critic still lives inside me. Pause. And I want to show you something. I just picked these up. These are Posca. You know the Posca paint markers. Have you ever used those?
They're fabric marker.
Well, I guess you would say they're kind of like a fabric marker, but it kind of lays over everything. It's almost like a kind of like a new age, like this acrylic paint marker, like the graffiti kids used to use. And the white goes down really great. The black is really striking. But I just found that they make brush pens.
Ooh,
also
acrylic ink or. Have you tried one yet?
You know what? I kind of did, and then I kind of put it down.
So you like tagging your house?
I was fussing with it a little bit, and then I was just like, because it has like the, you can hear the ball rattling around. Yeah. But then it's supposed to flow like a brush pen, and I'm going to get back to it, but I guess, and that's every time I would buy a new art supply, Mike would say, "But is it waterproof?" That's the first thing that came out of his mouth. Is it waterproof? I don't know, Mike. But it says water-based paint marker, so that's not good.
So it's not waterproof.
It's water-based. I don't know. I'll get back to you when R&D concludes their research. I'll get back to you on that.
You're gonna draw a really nice splash page and then like throw a bucket of water on it and see what happens.
That's right. Good evening, JRD. Good evening, Shelley. And you know what? Also, go ahead. Were you going to say something, Steve?
Yeah. What was that? You asked a question about you hosting a cartooning show. I think that would be amazing. I don't want that to go away. I like that. I like that thought. I want. Put that into what inspired the question?
Well, you said Mark Kistler's Draw Squad,
right?
And you know what? It isn't a bucket list because I've done things like this. If you search the deep YouTubes, you'll find videos of me, a lot younger me, probably 12, 13 years younger me, drawing during a kids program segment. And there's a bunch of them. It's Draw with Jamar. And one of our buddies was part owner of a kids TV show. What was it? Hollywood Hal and Rhinestone Al?
Yeah.
Our buddy Scott Neely. And he asked me to do segments. It was basically like a modern Sesame Street. And I think it ran for a long time up along the Panhandle. Guys, I'm geographically illiterate. I don't know where the Panhandle is, so just kind of play along with me. In like southern states or whatever. It's like if you lived in Texarkana, you might have
ran into the skillet handle.
That's right. And I never saw any episodes, but I recorded like maybe 10 or 11 sessions, and it was a lot of fun. But there's something that kind of unlocked in me when I did that. I was like, well, this is fun, and I always enjoyed. I never saw Mark Kistler, but I saw the books, and I enjoyed Bruce Blitz. You remember Bruce Blitz, his cartooning thing. And Mike, what was the name? Remember that guy with the beard? This is like 70s, 80s, who would draw a story while he was narrating it. They were all kind of creepy.
I don't know.
You know who I'm talking about?
I remember Bruce Blitz, but I don't remember. that.
This was a different dude. I can't remember. He was like before Bob Ross, and he wasn't Mr. Rogers, but he would like start off with like a blank piece of like almost like butcher paper, and he would read the story, and then he would like draw.
That sounds familiar, but I
If
don't
it-
think I saw that in Detroit or Michigan.
If anybody in the
Thing,
maybe if any of the people in the chat know what I'm talking about, save me here. In some podcast news, you guys, we are so close to 1,000 subs. We're like so close, and if you're one of our longtime viewers or our repeat offenders, as I like to call you, and you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, what are you doing to me? Just, make sure you hit that like button, the thumb, but also subscribe, please, because after we get 1,000 subs, our whole world's changed as we know it.
Yeah.
We control the algorithm.
The drones full of cash are just circling, but they can't land until.
Flowers smell better. Your whites are whiter. My teeth get brighter. It's amazing.
All your markers are waterproof.
That's where all my markers are. What up, Deep Red? Deep Red says, did he have gray hair and a mustache? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Yo, what up, Paul Pate? Life after 1,000. We can only dream. So, please get us there so we can start the next chapter of Pencil to Pencil. You guys, we have found our own algorithm. I'm so excited to talk about how we're doing this new thing in 2023, right? We have a guest. We have a really cool topic to discuss and demo with when we don't have a guest. I've been having a lot of fun. I know that a lot of our viewers have been saying some really great things in response to our topics. And we have another hot one for you tonight. So Mike, do you want to, I don't know if you're ready to prime we have a lot to talk about. So I don't know if you want to jump right into it or if you want to kick the ball around a little bit more.
Well, I just also wanted to mention that I think we just went over the 4-year mark on the podcast.
Oh my goodness! Wow. Your kid just graduated from high school.
Yeah, that came up in my feed this week on my Facebook memories.
Wow, was it the first? And is this the first, like when we started using YouTube and Facebook?
Before YouTube, when we were.
Oh, this is like we're doing it on Skype interviews, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow. So they hadn't done this.
Yeah, because the YouTube thing came out of, we were in the pandemic, right? And this just kind of opened up all of a sudden where you could go live on Facebook. And I remember a lot of people were just making really goofy use of that tool. Like they'd be at the mall, like bouncing around on the screen, talking about how they're going to Sephora to get makeup. I'm like, I think we could do something else with this, right? And like everything just started to line up, and the connections were stable enough that you could do a nicely produced show. And and once we added the YouTube part to it, we're off to the races. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with us and enjoying this rich ore of comic book content that only your favorite miners and these can bring to you. So might as well get into it because Mike has a lot to talk about. So this is another part of our layouts series where we've kind of touched on different aspects of comic book making. I know if you're somebody who's watching who just really wants to know how to put stubble on Wolverine's arms, I'm sure we'll get to that at some point. But I think some of the coolest parts of this are the parts of speech. The stubble series, the parts of speech of making comics. And there's so many, and I've talked about this before just in person, that if you just want to know the time, you can look at your watch and it'll tell you. But if you want to know how that clock ticks, you open a thing up and you see all those little gears that make the watch turn around. And that may not be for everyone. not everybody wants to know how the little hammer strikes the thing and makes the thing go. But if you're a dyed-in-the-wool, curious George, you're really going to enjoy this episode. So, Mike, you want to tell them what we're talking about tonight?
Yeah. So it touches on what we talked about before with doing the layouts and adapting from the script to print. And one of the things I always say when I do lectures like this, when I would have class, is that, we tend to study things individually, but it's actually all connected, and it all, it's like a sweater. If you pull the string, it's going to unravel this arm. Once it unravels, the buttons are going to fall off. So, this is tonight what we're talking about with how the panels and the page layout, how they work together. These are my own observations, mostly just from learning on my own, because I didn't go to school for comics. I learned how to do comics by reading comics, not reading books on comics. I mean, I had the Sema book, but it doesn't really get into the formal aspects of page layout and things like that. And I didn't read the Eisner book either. I think that came out when I was already working, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are things that I learned through observation and comparing why I liked one artist. And then you study one artist or you read an interview and they said, oh, my influence was this artist.
Mm-hmm.
So you really, for me, especially I think in artists of my generation, you learned, and the previous generation, you learned the history. And originally it was all sort of like handed down by hand, because you would be somebody's assistant and you would learn from that senior artist. And then, you would go on and then you would have an assistant. And now we live in this amazing time where any artist, any subject, any aspect of cartooning, there's a video, there's a podcast, there's a book, there's copies of just about every single artist's work you can think of. You can find samples now.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about this week's subject, and I was thinking, for me, it goes back to learning from the comic strips and how the comic strips invented comics and invented the format and invented the language. And then how the comic books, which were originally reprints of comic strips, picked that up. And each generation, each decade, artists added to that language, added to that sophistication. And the audience, as we went along, also started out with that simpler language, then more complicated language. So if you were a person who started watching movies in the 20s or 30s, by the time the 40s came around, so much had been invented. So much of the language of storytelling had been perfected and had become much more sophisticated. And an 8-year-old reading your graphic novel today, Jamar, is being exposed to 100 years of comic book storytelling, right? Without even knowing it, right? You're being exposed to this history of a language, of a visual language. And so tonight, my lecture will be on basically panel and page layout and how they relate to each to each other.
Steve, you got it. Thank you, Steve.
So we're going to start out with, and everyone here is probably pretty familiar with this, but like when I teach a storyboard class, I talk about how there's basically 6 shots, and almost every film is made up of one of those 6 shots: a close-up, a medium shot, an establishing shot. And comics is the same, right? We sort of have, especially now, a basic language of panels, the type of panel. You sort of have your standard panel, like the first one, you have a long panel, or horizontal, or sort of like a landscape panel. You have the transition panels, which you have the bubbly, wavy word balloon panel, or the other wavy sort of flashback panel. And then other sort of effect panels like the, raggedy border edge. So, somebody will do something to the border to draw attention to that panel being special in some way, right? Some dramatic action. It could be an earthquake, or, and I was looking at trying to find, sort of like being an archaeologist, like, well, who was the first one who drew that bubbly dream outline, right? And who's the first one who drew the wavy, came up with the idea of drawing the wavy panel border to indicate a transition, right? A transition of a dream, or a transition to a flashback. And I wonder, I have not come across any definitive answer myself, but I would imagine that the early artists, like that were doing, like Little Nemo, or any of those early comic strips, were also going out to the cinema and like, oh, look at that cool effect, right? New things are happening all the time. In the 20s, 30s, 40s, new things, new techniques were happening all the time. And so and then vignettes, which is another idea of a panel where you basically crop something except for part of it, right? And now it could be like this, it could be a figure, or it could be a figure in a landscape, or it could be an object. But what you don't have is you don't have the contiguous panel border going all the way around. And you'll see that as we go through the examples tonight. And then just a real primer on a lot of what we're going to see tonight, which is the layout of the page.
Yeah, you're blowing my mind already, Mike Manley.
Right. So the standard is the grid, and most comics are grid. Most comics that have ever been drawn are in some form of a grid, right?
That's your bread and butter right there. Yeah.
Right. Now, most comic strips, most comic books that have ever been drawn are in the grid. And I can think of things like, Tintin, Tintin. I can think of Prince Valiant, Flash Gordon, the classic comic strips, going into the classic comic books. And so I'm going to show examples by artists that were important to me, or that I learned from, and we can see how they often employed these 4 types of grids that you see here. The other one is a horizontal grid, or cinematic, which we see a lot now. I would say specifically since the 80s, you started seeing a lot of that. Then you have what I call the vertical first layout, where you have a long vertical panel and then a series of panels that come after that. And then you have what I call, I should say, the open page, where this also is something that probably is much more pronounced now because we have bleed books. Now you will see artists that I will show who were doing it before bleeds, but now that there's bleed books, you see a lot of this where you will have, what I want to say is a meta panel with panels floating on top. And it's a really, it's a way of playing with time, a way of playing with space, a way of playing with what is important, and it's much more sophisticated. And so we will see examples of artists who use that. So that's what we're going to start out with tonight. So let me get rid of this.
Mike, I can't tell you how geeked I am about this episode, because this is, like I put in the chat, this is, to a comic book artist, the 6-panel grid is your bread and butter. It's your drinking, your two-step. You should stay right here in the pocket, right? It's like the funky drummer, right? It's just it's evergreen.
Right. So can you see that? Is that up now?
Yeah, Steve's got it.
Okay. So my first example here is Little Nemo in Slumberland, which I didn't really come on to be honest, probably into my 30s. I think I'd seen examples of it, but as it became more and more of a student, and actually probably, I would say, becoming a teacher makes you more of a student, because as you try to teach students, you try to come up with examples of different ways of working. Also, again, the history of the medium, because we all stand on top of the shoulders of the artists who came before us, whether we want to like their work or admit their work or not. So this is a great example of a page where you see these, he would always have these weird dream sequences, and he played around with the format quite a bit. And one of the things that's interesting is, like, this is the title, then you see him getting ready to go to, he's having his dream, and then you see the fantasy, and then when you're in the fantasy, you get the irregular shaped panels, right? And then as you fall or you wake up, you go back to a very small panel, echoing the first panel.
It's like a roller coaster.
Right. So it's circular, right? It's circular. And I also found it very interesting that you had the word balloons, but then you had the narration. Now, the other thing is to try to remember that the newspapers in the old days were ginormous. They're tabloid size papers. They're like 3 times the size of a newspaper now. So these illustrations were beautiful and very large, and
they're full page. Right?
Yeah, they were. Yeah. So this is a full page. Again, a full page.
Y'all ain't ready, y'all.
Right? It's a full page. But what I also find interesting is how he played. It's a grid, but within the grid, the size of the panel has to do with what he is showing, the orientation of the panel. So again, you see he comes back to the same small panel at the end. This work was very influential on Mobius when he was doing a lot of his, like, Airtight Garage, things like that. And then I love this because you really see how you start out very small, and then the panels grow as the dream grows, as the bed's legs grow, and then you go back down to echoing the same panel. Of course, now he's on the floor.
Oh, I love
Right.
this stuff. Yeah.
Right. And again, this is very what's in the panel is what's exciting. So these are all basically squares or rectangles.
Yeah, it's really interesting that in the parts where he is at least losing before he completely goes into dreamland, just as it starts off very isometric and flat and lines are perpendicular, but as soon as it wakes up, everything is askew and we've got perspective, and so the rigid grid of the panels really makes all that liveliness of the legs of the bed pop. It's just beautiful.
Right. And I think that is something that we will see in other artists as we go through. Another great early cartoonist who was very, very influential on generations of people was Milton Caniff. And again, this is a Sunday page, so it's a grid. One of the issues you had to deal with as an artist is you have to deal with the format. So you have to deal with the format of the paper, and therefore the format of the paper, the size of the paper, and some papers would take these strips and cut them and rearrange them. So that's why you'd usually have the first panel, the title panel, would be what they call a drop panel. Now, I still actually have that on Judge Parker. The first tier, and you see here the top tier, the first tier of Judge Parker can be lost in some papers. Not every paper carries it. You see it online, but you don't see it in every paper. And again, all these panels are the same size except for the first and the last. But look what's inside of the panel. So what you're doing is you're really concentrating on the story. Your focus is, he is what I call a traditionalist. And we will show some other artists, I think, that are traditional. So he's a traditional storyteller, very much like you were sitting and you're watching a movie where the size of the picture you're watching, the screen, doesn't change shape. It's always the same shape, right? And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that he wants you to read his story. He wants you to read what is going on and look at the pictures. It's not, let's say, as exciting or bombastic as we will later on see some superhero pages where the effect of how the panels and the page is laid out is trying to give you some almost like a physical feeling of the action that is taking place, right? So he was very, because he was the first guy who really did that kind of straightforward, almost cinematic storytelling. And he was very influential on the artists who came, including people like Jack Kirby. So Jack Kirby, Will Eisner, Joe Kubert, all the great Silver Age guys that came after. This one's a little bit later, but you see the same thing. You really, this is storytelling. You're going to read this. You're going to look at it. Even look at the gutters. Everything is very even, right? So it's all about boom, boom, read, going from one image to the next, right? It's not about trying to do something that's as weird and creative and dreamy as Little Nemo, was McKay's work, Winsor McKay's work.
Hey, Mike, can you go back to that Kniff page that you just showed? That
Which
one?
this one?
No, the other one. Yeah, this one. I love in the last panel how it's almost like an optical extra panel with the doorway, right? And the way it's framed, like the characters are framed on either side of that. So it's almost like an inset inside itself, framing the car on the outside. It's beautiful work.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, and I love how you get a lot of depth and storytelling, world building on this page because you see, you're seeing scale, right?
Yeah.
You're seeing scale on this page, right? You're seeing a long shot. And that again, that's very important in for people to read these characters and believe them. And before television came in, the two most exciting visual mediums were movies and comics, and they co-influenced each other. I think they definitely I think these guys are looking at movies, and movies were looking at comics.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of cross-pollination, but because artists always look at other artists, right? Artists are all, painters look at other painters, musicians listen to other musicians. Visual artists are always looking at other visual artists. And this was a hotbed of creativity the first 20, 30 years of the last century, where all these mediums were being basically invented. And each week, each month, each issue, each Sunday strip, each weekly strip, each movie was a chance for somebody to sort of reinvent or add something to the lexicon.
Mike, you know what I love, and I don't know if you're going to get to him, but Bill Watterson, who created Calvin Hobbes, uses a lot of just like crazy panel design in his pages, and he's such a throwback to the old school comic strip guys that I think a lot of modern people don't, feel like he may have invented, that stuff, but it came from a source.
And with Terry and the Pirates, Mike, with these examples that you've shown here, they have identical layouts. So in that case, the layouts for those are all regimented because, like you said, it had to be reconfigured for various layouts. So these are better. You say these are better examples of what you could do within the space, because you talked about both the medium shot, the long shot, the establishing shot, and that's kind of what you do within the panel. So that's really the part of this. That's really what you would look to Milton Caniff for, right? It's not so much the layouts. That was never the shape of that wasn't the page layout. It was what you could do within those constraints, right?
Right. And again, like I said, to me, he's a traditionalist, right? We're going to, as we go along, we will see people where the opposite is true. It's the layout and the shape of the panel and the space between the panels become very important to them. But here he's just going, I'm telling a story. I want you to read this story. Everything is even. And as far as the size of the panels, except for that first and that last panel. But again, I think that a lot of that also has to do with the format of the newspapers.
Right.
So every medium has some restrictions, and it's how you as an artist find a solution to a problem for one of those, problems that are presented to you. And then I just wanted to toss the Gasoline Alley stuff in there because, again, I think that it's a grid, and you can really see, I think, how it's just, while all the panels are the same, what's happening inside each panel is beautiful. And so because of the shape of the panel all being the same, you concentrate more about what is happening inside of the panel. You can definitely see that people like Chris Ware and a lot of modern cartoonists are very influenced by this aesthetic. I just think this is a magnificent strip. not only for the design and the color, but just all the drawing, the shape, everything it's just beautiful. And to me, because it is a grid, it focuses you on what's going on. It's not trying to compete with you with flashy layout and flashy drawing, right? It's just saying, pay attention, look at this. And I think if you had crazy layouts with this, then you would have something else. You wouldn't have the sort of quaint and cute and whimsy. I think the whimsy would be counteracted by having an overactive layout, you know. And again, there were a lot of strips that were just like this. Were just straight ahead storytelling. And here you have a meta panel made up of all the other panels, and you have the characters going around. So again, if he had changed the shape of those panels to make some longer and some thinner or whatever, it would definitely give you a completely different feeling than what you achieve by making it a grid. You know, a lot of times people think a grid is boring, but that's definitely not boring. And again, he's an artist whose work I came to later, because I think I had a Smithsonian book, or I had a book that had reprints of his work that I had not seen before.
You know, it's funny, Mike, that I think, and this, maybe this is a conceit, but I would think that somebody would not assume that you like comic strips.
Well, I mean, we've
it's kind of like, you know, we've talked about it, it's kind of like, I wouldn't, not me, but I think the royal you would go, oh, Mike likes the Cats and Jammer kids.
Yeah, I've always liked comic. I've liked all kinds
of I don't see it in your work. Or something to that effect.
There's things that influence you that you may not see in the work, but that might also be because the work, the job that you're doing, doesn't allow you the opportunity to display that aspect of design or drawing that you may like. Like when I did my cartooning stuff, when I was doing Action Planet, I started doing my own self-publishing. People like, oh, you like to do humor stuff? You like to do funny stuff? But just because I had drawn Batman didn't mean that I didn't like to draw other stuff. I just never had the opportunity to do it. And all businesses tend to typecast you. Like actors get, oh, you do a villain? Going to make you a villain, right? If you do a comedy and it's successful, we want you to do comedy, right? You know, was it Tom Hanks played a villain when he was in that movie where he was the hitman, Road to Perdition, right? But because he had reached a position in his career that he could afford himself the opportunity to play against type, right? So now we've moved on to who the guy I think is sort of like the first intellectual, which is Will Eisner. And now you can see here the long horizontal panel as the start, and then the regular grid inside, next to that. And I think, again, he was the first guy, as I understand it, who really started playing around with those kind of page layouts with the spirit insert. And we will see, because he was a guy that was very influential on the first generation of like the Silver Age guys like Kubert and Kubert and Infantino and all those early DC guys. And you can see he liked that format because he used it over and over again.
That's gorgeous.
Contract with God, which was, 40 years later or something, 30, 40 years later. And it's just, you also see, because he left this open, or that border is so thin it almost looks like it's open. Now that might be bad reproduction, but you can see here he's definitely sort of doing what I call like a meta panel, and then floating the other panels over that, and it opens up the page because it's like a bleed now. So now you're being able to open up the page. Again, a grid, and it's what's inside that's very exciting.
James from YouTube says that log panel a couple pages back, very webtoon friendly.
Well, we'll get to the webtoon thing towards the end here. But he was the first guy who really started playing around, I think, with the format. Also because, he was like his own boss. So he was writing the story. He could plan that out. The way he moved the balloons around within the panels, over the panels, little inset panels floating on top of other panels, that was something that you didn't really see in comics before that. Right? Again, you see your interesting panel shape.
You barely see that building in panel 1. It's amazing. All those word balloons. Almost like they're turning into the exhaust of the cars.
Right. But look, because there's no border on that, that's a vignette. How that opens up the page. And now we're going to sort of get into guys I think that are what I call world builders. Right? So Ditko, like Kirby, is a world builder. And Ditko and Kirby always, especially the majority of their Marvel pages, worked in a grid. And because they worked in a grid, their stories are very dense. There's a lot of story, a lot of world building that's going on within this page, where I think if you started making the panels bigger, you get dynamics because you get bigger figures, but you get less world building. It's a little bit more, to me, intimate when you make the panel smaller. I mean, you got all these great figures, and he's definitely a cartoonist. I mean, his version of New York, is a cartoonist's version of New York, very much like Chester Gould or something. But I just love the grid. And sometimes he'll take out the backgrounds to just sort of open it up. But all these multiple figures and everything. I mean, his 39 issues of Spider-Man really defined the character in a way that if he had not done those pages the way he did, I don't think we would have had Spider-Man the way he is today. That sort of weird, quirky, strange. And of course, this is one of the most famous sequences. So not only is there the grid, and then you have the long horizontal panel at the bottom, but then the position of the character within the panel. So you really feel Spider-Man getting beat down. And I just think I saw these pages when they did that Spider-Man exhibit at the Society of Illustrators a couple of years ago.
Oh, they're gorgeous, right?
Yeah, I don't know who owns them, But it was just so amazing to see these pages. But again, to me, the storytelling, the compactness of the storytelling is so effective because he's using a grid.
That's so good.
You know, and you know, he's also leaving a lot of room for Stan to write.
Mm-hmm.
I seem to remember seeing some of the old drawing paper of Marvel's where they would have those 3 tiers pre-demarcated on the paper. Like
Some publishers did, yeah.
Like they would say, this is where we're going to have these tiers, and then what you do within them is kind of up to you. But it seemed to be always like 3-2-2, 3-2-3. Really interesting.
Yeah. So now we go from Ditko right into Kirby. And so what I did is I just selected a bunch of pages from his run on the FF, right? And Kirby, in the beginning, was doing a lot of panel to panel, showing the characters acting, showing, you know, the characters using their power, but it always a grid. Even all the way through to the last stuff he did, he was a grid guy. And you would see him repeat, you know, the same format over and over again, as far as almost like the way the pages were laid out, because to him, it was important what happened in the panel. He wanted that panel is like a window into his world, a window into his story. And he wanted you to concentrate on what's happening in the story, right? So this is a really early FF page, right? And you have a lot of small figures, right? So this is like the early Kirby, not the Kirby we think of later. But you see a lot of, you know, seeing Mr. Fantastic come through. So you can see him using his powers, and you see the characters in relationship to their environment. And you look, everything is very formal, very straightforward. So you're really concentrating on reading the story. You're not even really paying attention to the panel borders. Oh, you know, there you got a little, you know, dream sequence bubble, right? And he also did this too, where he would add the little head of the character who was talking, which I love. It's like something that's gone now, but I always love that to me, you know, where you have the head of the person who is narrating the
like next to it.
flashback. You know,
Hey,
I mean,
hey,
it's
Mike,
such a pure comics thing.
Mike, there's a question I want to see if you can address, or maybe we can kick this ball around our buddy Paul Pate. What up, Paul Pate? Paul Pate says, if 5 faces and 3 cars is a lot of visual info, and 1 face is less visual info, can you give your thoughts on how varying the amount of visual information throughout frames impacts a page?
I'm not sure if I quite understand the question.
Well, I guess maybe, and maybe Paul can check me on this. I'm thinking about like visual busyness, like, you know, and the story you're trying to tell. Like, can you maybe give somebody an insider thought on how do you know when something's too much on a page?
Well, I think this is a good example, right? So you've got a lot of torch flying around and everything. You got all these figures, and you would see this very early on. He would just decide to eliminate the background,
Right.
right? There's a lot of pages here where you know they're shooting at the helicopter, but they eliminate the background, right? Very open. It's very clear. You don't even have to think about it. You look at it, you know exactly what's going on, right? The same with Ditko. The image processes in your mind in a second, right? If you go back, or we'll go forward here. So this is about midway through, and you were starting to see more of what we think of as Kirby. The figures are more dynamic, they're bigger, they're bolder, but still the grid, right? Long panel, top, horizontal panel, 3 in the middle, and he's very habitual about that. And then here's a little bit further, you know, the great first Silver Surfer and Galactus storyline, you know, it's what happens in the panel. So the shape of the panel and how many panels on the page are determined by what he's trying to show. So he's got one big horizontal panel and then 4 basically squares. But what you see in each panel is very dynamic. You see all the figures, you see what's going on very clearly, right? Here's a couple issues later. This is the page from that great This Man, This Monster issue of the FF. And so I think he is a master, one of the masters of storytelling. And he's also a traditionalist. He doesn't mess around with crazy panel borders. He doesn't mess around with fancy layouts. It's all very straightforward. And he was always like that. And we think of him as being like this, you know, super crazy dynamic artist, but his storytelling and his layout and his panel designs are all very traditional. All very traditional. I mean, look at that dynamic shot of, you know, the Thing fighting the Silver Surfer. And he does not break the panel border. Now, today, you know, you'd have a bleed page and the panel border would be broken and the character would be coming out. But, you know, I don't think you can get better than this. Those other things may add something, but I don't think it makes anything better. And then again, this is just a storytelling page, right? It's not a dynamic page as far as layout or even figures. And look at all those figures that he's drawing. You know, this important part of the story.
Their outfits are dynamic,
right? But he's such a great storyteller within that. So he's reusing the same here as here. He's using the same horizontal and then 4, horizontal and then 4. And his work, I remember in one moment reading the Fantastic Four and realizing, yeah, he's just sort of like, oh, here's the same thing, now it's just reversed. He used that same format over and over and over and over. Yet you never go, well, this is boring. This is, you know, you're not even aware of it, you know. I mean, he and Ditko were the kings of doing that 9-panel page and packing in all this great storytelling.
Mike, all right, they're kind of chopping this up in the chat. So back to what Paul was asking. So Shelley says, one face of what they feel react is important. Don't want tons of detail here. So it seems like we're talking about like one face or one image in a panel to create drama or suspense with that character, and then adding more lessens that. And I could be murdering this, but then Paul says, yeah, I was thinking along those lines. So I guess maybe is this less about panels and more about like what you're doing on a page to give drama to the character?
Well, you know, here you have 9 panels, and mostly it's, you know, you have the one big panel, Ben, very sad. In these 2 shots, I mean, what you put in the panel and the shape of the panel all has to relate to what you need to show in the moment for the story. And so I think you don't see anything more than you need to see, and you don't see anything less than you need to see. right? The whole point of this page is to show the thing depressed, stumbling into the woman, oh my God. And then he feeling bad about himself and, he's a monster. And then you see him walking on even smaller and feeling smaller himself. So you can very clearly follow the storytelling without having to read any of the word balloons. You know exactly what is going on. And so I think what you put in the panel has to do with that story point. That's what guides you. If you feel like, oh, these other faces in there are taking away from this person's expression, then you take them out.
Right.
And then another guy who was a great world builder. I just put a few in. Just was
Tezuka, yeah.
Right.
Mike did that for me. Yeah, I'd love to hear what you think about his stuff.
And I think he's very much just again grid. And what's sort of interesting is you see just a little something going over the panel border.
A little bit.
A little. He didn't do both fists. He just did one fist. Right. But I think, again, this is very clear, simple storytelling. Horizontal panels that fit horizontal shapes. Vertical panels that fit vertical layout for vertical storytelling. I mean, it's all very and like his own version of Kirby Crackle. So you wonder if he was like looking at Kirby. But again, vertical panel for something vertical. So the shape of the panel, how many panels are on a page. But again, you never feel that you're not getting enough or that you're getting too much or that you're being cramped. Right. And he like Kirby or Ditko or Kniff is a traditionalist. It's about what happens in the panel and the shape of the panel and how many panels that go on the page all relate to moving the story along. It's easier, I think, with action, because action's easier to lay out.
Oh, Mike, this is a great question from our good friend Shelly on YouTube. And Shelly will never come on this show as much as I've begged her. Shelly says, thoughts about comic books versus strips. Strips are one at a time. Book pages are two at once. Is there an instance where layouts fight each other, Mike?
I don't think so. And I think what I'm trying to remember, very early on, I learned that Kubert laid out 2 pages at a time. So he was aware of, when he laid out his pages, how they related to each other, right?
It's really important.
Now, again, I think somebody like Kubert was also intellectual. He was very visceral and dynamic like Kirby. But I think he was a little bit more influenced by Eisner, as we'll see as we go along. Now, another artist who was really important to me when I was growing up was Neil Adams. And so here's a Batman story. Very straightforward, grid. Even the spaces between the panel borders are all the same. Mm-hmm. So you're just concentrating on reading the story and what is going on in the panels, right? And this is a great sequence. You get to see him fighting. He chooses a sort of dynamic upshot, but for the most part, it's just real straightforward, right? Real grid, very straightforward. And again, he always chooses great dynamic shots, down shots, and he drew, wonderfully. So he made everything kind of cool and exciting, right? And I know I love this. I love this story. But then, after Batman is hit and kind of knocked out, it kind of goes into this kind of weird, kind of kooky layout. Now, I never talked to him about this, so this is just my surmising. I feel like maybe he did this because he wanted that sense of disorientation to affect the reader, right? Although I do sort of question this figure in the first panel kind of bleeding into the fourth panel, but because we go from the first panel to the second and third panel. So this transition here, even though that's a great figure, right? That bothers me.
It's like you're skipping the two above it, the way that's set up. Yeah.
Well, not only am I skipping the two above it, but I'm connecting in a very odd way to the first panel.
Yeah.
Now, if he had just gone through and he just made this up,
just cut that right there.
Triangle panel. Then I don't feel that way.
And I think also one thing to add while we're going through this is that there's some things that you see maybe less advanced artists do in their pages, where you might see arrows going from panel to panel to panel, trying to lead you in a direction, which is usually a giant mistake. Like if you can't if you can't visually follow where things are going, then it doesn't work.
So he goes, and then then we build up to this point where you meet the Joker, and then when you meet the Joker, then you do this crazier layout where you have the figure superimposed over everything. But I think that this superimposition and this vignette of the Joker, this is sort of like a vignette, because you sort of bleed the fourth panel down into the or the third panel, you bleed it into the fourth panel. So it's like a vignette in a vignette. I think works because Batman's sort of disoriented and you've got this crazy looming Joker. I think that works in a way that is a little confusing to me because I keep getting pulled back.
Yeah, I like that page, but that one I find is a mess. I find that one really hard to read. The other one with Batman crawling, I kind of like that effect. I just wish the word balloons guided you over. I feel like you're absolutely right that there's a cul-de-sac of two panels that kind of get lost.
Right, and then he goes back to basically straight ahead grid, except for Batman's arm coming over. So now I don't know whether that transition of going back into the previous panel is worth it. Would have been better to just run the Joker's body down, just run that panel down. So I sort of question that in a formal sense, that sometimes, you can be very creative, but it also, like, this doesn't bother me as much as this, because we're going back in time. To me, this is and not as successful a design choice, I would say. Fantastic, iconic Batman drawings, but not something that and then I jump right in real quickly to his X-Men stuff, which he started introducing these sort of slashing panels, and I never quite liked this stuff as much. I liked some of the drawing, but I found that this was sort of confusing to me. I always found the layouts on this stuff sort of confusing. Now, I feel what he was doing is he was trying to sort of do his version of a Marvel comic, his version of trying to create something that was as visually potent and as exciting as Kirby. And so that page works better because you have something flying and then something falling. So I think that the layouts and the panel shapes work better. But this is like a crazy page, right?
Oh, Mike, can I jump in? I don't mean to be dueling swords with you tonight. I think you're doing a great job. But going back to, I think it was Shelley who asked about the dueling pages of the spreads. I think generally at your thumbnail phase, you're kind of looking at everything as a whole. So that'll be the perfect time to make that symmetrical. So if you have this like very wild panel on the right, I know I would try to do at least something that mirrors it on the left, just for symmetry's sake. Thanks, Mike. That's all I wanted to say.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think if you lay out 2 pages and doing layouts at the same size as the person is, print size, helps you really see visually how it's going to impact the viewer. With comic strips, it's the same every day. So it's really the most traditional because, you're not really going to ever, be bouncing things around as much because you just don't have the real estate, So again, this is sort of a crazy, this is the 60s, very dynamic, but it's also a little odd and I sort of find it hard to read sometimes when I look at these things, these pages by him.
I find myself reading the balloons in totally the wrong order because they're next to each other, but you're supposed to read another panel first. You're supposed to finish your panel before you move on to the next one. That's what it feels like. It feels like it's a very strict challenge. Like the Cyclops' dialogue in that last panel there is bleeding into the first panel. It's almost like you want to read it because I don't know. It's a very convoluted thing.
Well, again, this is one of those issues that you get with working from a plot, as we were doing previously, right? So Neil laid this stuff out from Roy Thomas's script. Now, I would imagine that if he had the full script, he would not have pushed Cyclops' head so close that you would force those balloons back. But yeah, so again, one of the things that you deal with is the formatting of how time works by the grid and about the page layout. And so you follow along. It's easy to follow, even though I don't like that narration thing going in. It's still easier to read that page. But yes, it does sort of, to me, violate the time by going back that way.
This really cool pages and really cool panels, but it just feels like the lettering was an afterthought.
Yeah, and I sort of wonder who placed the word balloons. I don't know if Roy Thomas placed them, or I would imagine that he did. But I mean, again, he's trying to make something very exciting, and he's trying to show second by second incidents of Hank Pym falling and tumbling through the air. But I don't know whether am I reading it like this, right? I'm going up. So when I read it this way, I sort of feel like, was this the first? I start getting confused about this the first panel, or am I going down and then going back up, right? And then here's a couple pages by of Master Race, and these are great great pages, and also a very intellectual approach. This is from, what did I say? This is from,
Christine.
Yeah, it's Kriegstein, but I'm trying to think. It's Impact, I think.
Right. Yes.
EC Comics. And he's one of the, this is like 1954. This is, this is the 50s. So you can see, to me, this feels very Hitchcockian and very claustrophobic and very cinematic. Again, because you're seeing moment by moment, moment by moment by moment. But because it's linear and because it's in the grid, I think I concentrate more on the guy falling, and then that flashy strobic image of the train going past, right?
Marcel Duchamp, futurist.
Right. So I find that this is actually confusing because of the way the grid is arranged, even though it is dynamic, right? It's very superhero, it's very Marvel, very dynamic. This is much more cerebral, and I would say much more cinematic and less confusing, even though this is a very dense page, right? Here's another page by him from another story. And the EC stuff had a very strict sort of format. They supposedly did the Leroy lettering was done before the pages were handed out. I don't know if that was in the case of Kriegstein, or if he cut the pages up or rearranged them. And then a lot of the stories for certain books were laid out by Kurtzman,
right?
And then the artist would follow, his layout. So from the very beginning, he was deciding how many panels, the size of the panel, the space between the panels. Again, this is very interesting because many frames, he doesn't have any panel. It almost appears like he doesn't have a panel border. The floating of the narration, again, opens the page up. It opens the page up. It's some Steranko, which obviously owes a lot to that work right there. So again, to me, this is an example of how artists look at other artists, get inspired by other artists, and then add something. Steranko is very graphic, a really great designer. And you see that here. Very thin panels, and then a big meta panel that he breaks into one panel that's broken into several panels.
Hey, Mike. Oh no, finish your thought. I'm sorry.
No, I was just, to me, that's a very sophisticated, and I don't know if Eisner did that first, but I have a feeling that he did.
I have another question from Paul Pate, the MVP of this episode, as everybody else is dumbstruck and they're just silent. And I thank everybody for watching. And also, alert, we're at 999 subs, Mike.
Oh.
Can we break through the wall tonight? Let's hope so.
And then here's another great page with very minimal word balloons. So again, it's sort of interesting how he focuses this sort of nice big metal panel. You see who everybody is, and then these very thin vertical panels. And I think a thin vertical panel in a page, on a comic page, reads different than a square. There's something about, to me, that thin vertical panel is saying you're just seeing a sliver. It suggests a smaller bit of something, just a visual, a smaller visual cue. And so you see a lot of small visual cues all at the same time. And you sort of read them at the same speed, right? So you have the big panel, which you take in, you slow down, you take in, and then all of these little bits.
That's masterful.
There's a question from Paul, who I don't think we've heard from tonight, who says, do thin panels mean shorter time? And that ties into what Shelley's saying about thin and tall slows things down. I also find that the lack of text in a panel will slow it down as well. I feel like without the text in the panel, you're like, oh, I don't have much time to spend with it. And you just sort of spend a little more time.
To me, visually, you read this as you see the train coming in, you see the two figures. This reads longer. You can almost hear the sound of the subway. And then here, you're taking one, second, and you're splitting it into, eighths of a second, right? And then you're back to bounce back to an equal size panel, although each one of these images is also like a slice of time. So I think it's very interesting to compare. I really think Steranko was thinking of this, was looking at this, and was thinking of how each one of these little slivers of time read more as a sliver of time, as the actual physical shape of the panel is a sliver.
Mm-hmm.
And again, a guy I learned a lot from was Joe Kubert. To me, there you go, starting out the big first panel, long horizontal panel. And then another great, fantastic page. And this is what I'm talking about, where you have the meta big image, but then you have these insets. You have these 3 equal insets. So you feel the space and the dynamics of this plane crashing, right? And so it's also arranged so that you do that. You go right along and you do that. So you get this nice sort of circular, everything in the branch, his body, the lead, everything is in that composition is leading you to see the plane crash. And I think that having that, and again, this is before Bleed, so this was not a Bleed book, but it opens up the page and gives you this sense of space that you have on a Bleed book. And then this is a Hawkman page, which is probably a decade or more before that Enemy Ace page. Again, that opening vertical panel. But because Kubert is also to me very formal, you're not lost by the placement of the word. I'm sure this is probably a full script. You're not lost or ever confused by the arrangement of the panels and the word balloon. So there's no reversal of time like we were seeing in the Adams work. And then here's a Frank Miller page doing the same thing, right? So you can go from Miller to Kubert all the way back to Eisner.
Mm-hmm.
Same idea carried all the way through from one artist to another art, and then each one adding their own little spin from their personality. And I really liked these Daredevil issues, I learned, I think, a lot about how to split up. But again, small vertical slivers of time. And I think, although I've never talked to Frank, I think he was thinking of this. It reflects back to this. Those vertical slivers. And his ultimate, which is Sin City, which I think combines elements of design and graphic aspect that you got from someone like Steranko.
I love that.
Another vertical. So you can see the same ideas carried over and over. And then here we're sort of going to end with Walt Simonson, vertical. But then Walt also does the secondary or third level where he has time by these little inset panels. And then the shape of the panel border here indicating like that heartbeat or the whatever that Superman is detecting there, right?
Right.
The fact that he vignettes that first panel really opens up and adds a lot of air to that page. And he was another artist like Kubert that I picked up on very early on. That sense of design with overlays, inset panels, the shape of the panel borders, very designed. So he would be not the traditionalist, although this is fairly traditional, but there's a design element that comes in that you start playing with time.
So good.
Then grid, but what's in each grid, what's in each panel, these small panels, you have these you have a meta panel, and then you have these individual panels, and you're getting, again, like a slice, just a little sliver. And it's a great way of playing around with time. Same thing here. This is a great page, straightforward. You feel, you're zooming in, then you pull out, and then you bleed. So you start out small, very small, and then you go all the way in on Thor, and then you pull the way out, all the way out again. It's very dynamic. It's very powerful. And one of the things Walt does too a lot is play around with sound effects, the design of the sound effects. So
it's a great page. Great page.
Here's some slashing panels and sound effects. But what you don't get is confused by what is going where and what you're reading in sequence.
Yeah, the word balloons are, again, really perfect placement. Even though a lot of the dialogue for panel 2 is up in panel 1, you're still reading top to bottom, so it's keeping you in a nice line. You don't get thrown off.
Right.
That's great.
Now, this to me is very much, this is from New Gods, this to me is very much like the Kubert Tarzan page.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look at that.
The same exact layout, right? A lot more curvy, a lot more powerful, like this, dynamic, screaming figure full of curvy energy. But it's the same idea, It's the same idea. So you can see how someone can take the same idea, but you have a very different feeling because Walt's work is very graphic. It's not as it's more flat. To me, I'm always aware of the fact that Walt's drawings are drawings in a way that I feel like Kubert's drawing is much more flesh, chiaroscuro, light and dark.
Yeah, greater sense of mass.
Yeah.
Mike, can you talk about the page turn for a second? Even with the examples that you've given us, especially with the comic book stuff.
Okay, well, I think this will be a good example for that. So then I saw these on the Walt Simonson Appreciation Facebook page. So I saw this great sequence. Right.
That's fantastic.
Now, this is to me, very straightforward and very traditional, less designy than this page, right? Which has, to me, what I call like the open page, where you have the two top panels sort of floating over the middle panel, and then two inset panels, basically. So everything is almost like an inset, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, his placement of the type of sound effects that John Workman, I sure probably did these. Also, there's a graphic design quality that's really playing here. But to me, this is very sort of straightforward storytelling. And so to me, if you had made this or like this, I don't think it would have been as effective. I don't think the storytelling would have been as effective. Because again, to me, when you do a grid, you're focusing in on the story. You say, just read this, just look at this, right? This, you're getting all kinds of other feeling, dynamics, Superman, you're getting movement. There's a lot of other things going on with this that you're trying to give the kinetic feeling of these characters. And so to me, it's a different feeling than this. Because now I'm just looking at what's going on inside the panel. Here I'm looking, my eyes moving around the page. There's a lot of interest, a lot of energy, dynamics, the sound effects, the angles of the sound effects. There's a lot going on here. Here, I'm just concentrating on what's going on inside the panel. Even though, again, he always has a great use of sound effects. I'm looking at what's going on in the panel because it's a grid. And because each one of those panels is the same size, it focuses your attention more on what's going on in that panel, right? And so there you got your first vertical panel, and then the same image as he meets his demise and goes to Valhalla. And I think that is so powerful because it is traditional and because you're dealing with the grid. You're not breaking the panel borders. You're not doing any of that other stuff. You're just going, look at what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And then just a couple of quick examples at the end here is, so like in the 90s, so we're going all the way up from the 20s and 30s to the 90s. in the 90s, it became very, image became big, and it really became about trying to get all this excitement and dynamics on the page. So like all the panel borders became crazy. You saw a lot of these sort of slashing panel borders and slashing images. And it's very kinetic, and I think it was very popular for a while, and I think it really appealed to the 14, 15-year-old kids at the time because it was very exciting. It's very 90s in the way that things were in the 90s. If you think about, like MTV and video games and trying to get as much excitement and dynamics on the page, but to me, it became more about the format and not about what was going. Like, I don't focus in on what's in the panel as much as I focus on what's going on the page, the image, the slashing, everything, right? I don't feel that this is it's exciting, but I don't feel that weight or the storytelling that I get something here by being more formal. You do get a lot of excitement. You do get a lot of energy. But then again, it's superheroes. So, maybe somehow it relates to what Wolf's doing here, right? Getting a lot of dynamic figures and shapes and things flying around. But I think that this is so much stronger. My eye bounces around a lot more on something like this, right?
And the color's doing a lot of heavy lifting and that stuff too.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
We're seeing the advent of digital color and holding color everywhere, and the letter is actually I think the letter is doing a lot of work to keep you moving through these pages.
That's
so I think it depends upon what you're going for. I think we see less of this now than we did, and then my final let me stop here. Let me get this up.
Check over here. 999 subscribers.
Do you believe it? Do you believe in miracles?
And then, we have talked a little bit about web comics and the whole young adult kid lit movement in comics, which is the biggest part of the business now, like what you're doing with Scholastic. And one of the things I did notice about looking at those stories is they're all grids. They're all very traditional, straightforward grid storytelling. You look at they're not playing around with the panel borders. They're not doing slashy, jiggy-jaggy stuff, right? This is like the Babysitter's Club. And what you're doing is you're sitting down and you're reading it. You're reading it. You're reading the story, right? You're not getting any cathartic lift by the dynamics of page shape. Most of your panels are squares or horizontals, very much like what we were looking with Kirby.
Yeah.
Right? It's very straightforward. You're going to read this. You're going to look at it. You're not going to be getting excited because there's, this last panel they're going to take and slice up into 10 frames, right?
It would be weird if it had that, right? It would be weird if the panels had any kind of, or anything other than rectangles.
Right. And so I think because you're telling stories to young adults, although a lot of people will bristle at it, I feel that the more traditional storytelling is easier to access. When you're looking at that stuff like Neil Adams is doing with the X-Men and stuff, that's when that was when the readers are getting older and more sophisticated. And so they were trying to make art that was also appealing and more graphic and had a modern graphic sensibility, like that stuff that Steranko was doing, that sense of design. But here, you're telling a story to, what, 12-year-olds? And they want to read about their characters, and they want to get into the characters' lives. And so I think that if you were choosing a format and panel shapes and panel layouts that started dealing with other more graphic, visually dynamic issues, you'd actually pull away from just telling the story.
Was there I had a sense, I'm not sure if this is true, Mike, but they got the sense looking at some of the Steranko and Neil Adams pages that there was a bit of showmanship going on from the artists, kind of like, I feel like that's such a big, like it was almost like overshadowing the story in some way. Like,
well, they were sort of challenging each other, I think, I mean, there was actually a panel that Adams drew that said, the way he moved stuff around in the background, and said, "Hey, a Steranko effect." You can actually Google that, right?
That's great.
And so I was just today really quickly going through like some of the top graphic novels, and here's Bone again, very traditional grid, very easy to read. Very much like what we were looking at with Ditko and Kirby. Storytelling, world building works very effectively by using a grid, and then the people concentrate on what's inside the panel.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like you don't have to concentrate on anything else. The story of what's going on inside that panel is good enough.
That second to last panel, can we just say how great that is? That beat, that empty beat of the match going out. It's hilarious. It's a black square, and it's so funny.
No, this guy's stuff is perennial. And then here's like the top guy, right, Jamar? I mean,
Dave Pilkey. Yeah.
Right? Now, this is not everybody's cup of tea. It's very cartoony, but everything is very hand drawn. Even the way the panels are done, the panel borders, everything is very kind of loosey goosey. It's very warm and sort of childlike, which probably also appeals to children because it's not perfect. It's not machine-like. It's not. And this guy is the most successful cartoonist in the world right now.
But there's absolutely something about this. I was looking at a lot of his stuff lately, doing this educational stuff, because I was like, there really is an effort in every panel to make every panel funny. There's no, it's like, seems to be like the figures are very cartoon, like the spines are bending. The previous page or pages in particular, there's all this bending and mugging to the camera and fourth wall breaking, and all this stuff is very, very lively. Like the broken neck in the third panel, it's all very pushed, and it's not as rigid as like a Garfield. It's way cartoonier. It's really cool to see. But but all that bending and all that flexibility inside, easy to follow, easy to read. Step 1, step 2, step 3.
Yeah. So I mean, if you look at what people are reading now, what young people are reading now, in 1965 they're reading Jack Kirby, and in 2023 this is what they're reading, and you're also getting a lot of girls reading comics who used to read comics, but then we kind of did away with the comics that a lot of girls used to read, like the romance comics and things like that. So this is a comic based upon the relationship of these characters, and so the panels are arranged in a way that's very easy for you to read. I mean, obviously, look at the size of the word balloons. I mean, there's a lot of dialogue going on here. There's a lot of writing. It's very dense, is when it comes to that. But the layouts and the panels and the shape of the panels and everything is almost a medium shot. Everything really is a medium shot. You don't even a close-up is a medium shot, right? That's like a medium establishing shot. So you're basically really just dealing with, it's almost all medium shots. And it's a grid. It's all a grid. And I think that that type of storytelling allows the reader to focus, especially the young reader, to focus on what is going on inside of the panel. Right. I think if you took that stuff and you laid it out like a Neil was doing on the X-Men, I think it might be exciting, but it might also be too much. It might actually take away from the story. You know, so there's a comfort to having a formal layout, panel design in a grid that allows you just to concentrate on telling the story. Right. If you had taken these panels and you had started adding slashes to them, or that kind of imagey thing, I think it would clash. So I think you have to choose the format and the formal aspect of your layout that works in conjunction with the type of story that you're trying to do, right? To me, that's and so I think it's really important, even if I'm not necessarily interested in reading a story about teenage girls babysitting, right? And I wouldn't say that I found the artwork overly appealing. I can see why young people like it and find it accessible. So you have to sort of put your thinking cap on,
Yeah, I love it. And also there's something to be said for doing kind of like kids age graphic novels where and this might speak a little back to what Paul was asking about, that from what I've seen, that there's not a need to pack a page with information, even like the Pilkey examples you showed. It's still a grid, but it's real breezy, and it's not breezy because kids are dumb. It's breezy because you're telling a story that needs to breeze along. There's really no need to put a 9-panel grid, or a 12-panel grid in a kid's book. This is just, I think there's an idea that you would think like a kid wants as much stuff as you can give them on a page, but I don't think the stories get told.
Sort of a Where's Waldo kind of a.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lane for that, but it's not necessarily in a kid's graphic novel.
Well, I think back to when I first started reading Mad Magazine, and then I would get the Son of Mad reprints, and so you would see the early Mad stuff and how dense that stuff was, right? It was like very, very dense. And I wonder if you were doing something that dense now would sort of be off-putting to the reader.
Yeah, I mean, even just considering the new age attention span of people, like I don't know if anyone wants to do that kind of homework. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. With Leon, were there any best practices that the publisher said, okay, this is the research we've learned, we've said that you could share, that say, 4 panels. If you do more than 4 panels in a page, you're going to start losing people. Is that sort of thing?
No, you know what? No, I didn't have conversations like that. But I'll tell you, at the beginning of the show, when you were holding up the Leon Protector of the Playground, I was learning on the job because even my layouts for that, I felt like I was packing in way too much stuff per page. And I calibrated an extraordinary, and I think it reads a lot easier now. There's from the cartoonist conceit of trying to put in way too much. There you go. To going like, how does this serve the story? And I think that's something we always have to keep in mind. So you're not dazzling a kid by putting in 300 things on a page. That's just my research.
Well, I also think that it depends upon the age.
Right. That's really important.
The type of story. Like humor probably works better with less because then you concentrate on the funny drawings,
Right.
Although, like I said, you could look at something like Kurtzman and Elder working together, and there was so much, as they would call it in the old days, chicken fat on that stuff. Especially Elder, he was putting all those zillions of little in-jokes in the background. And I don't know, I mean, if you were doing something like that today, I don't know whether the readers would appreciate that in the same way. But you also look at anime and you look at manga and talking about webtoons. So now you have a meta panel and a webtoon that can be this long vertical. You're not dealing with layout as far as like sometimes you're only seeing one image or two images. You can only fit so much on that screen, right? You can only fit so much room on that screen. And so you're thinking about time, you're thinking about reading, how much information is that? People are more impatient. Young people today are far more impatient than they were in 1980. And they in 1980 were far more impatient than I was in the 1960s. And so you have to take all of that into account. And I think one of the other things that kids like is getting a lot of something, right? A lot of something. So, when I was a kid, we could get those 50-page giant, would have a new story and a bunch of reprint stuff. But that's all I had, right? Unless I bought a reprint of Mad Magazine, then you'd get a little paperback. But kids now are starting out with graphic novels. So they're starting out with this very thick, if your first book is Leon, that's completely different than if your first book is like Dennis the Menace.
Yeah.
Reading comic strip.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I've already run into people who said, this is my kid doesn't like to read, but he loves Leon and this is his first thing. So think about what that does to somebody, right? That's great.
No, but if your first comic is a web comic, your relationship to images, your relationship to the format, your relationship to reading is this thing. Because comics, you have to, and movies are, you're sitting there and you are a passenger. You're not active, right? A comic, you are active. A comic, you actually have to look at it and put it all together, and it works at the speed of your brain, right? If you're a weak reader, you'll have a hard time reading it, and so you got to pick it up from looking at the images, right? And so I think now we live in this weird time where, on one hand, people are highly visually literate because we've had a century of amazing graphics and storytelling and movies and photography and design. So people today are visually very literate, but they're also extremely there's never been a generation of people that is more impatient than the current people alive. And I even see that with people who read the comic strips, who are many of them older than I am, right? And they're very impatient to, read your 3 panels, 2 panels a day. So I think it's also an interesting problem to try to solve if you're doing a webcomic, or if you were to do a webcomic and said that later on I want to adapt it into a print volume. Right? Those are that's a whole conversation, and a whole separate set of problems. But when you read a comic, you are participating. When you are looking at a movie, you're the audience. You're sitting there, and it comes at you.
Yeah, that's something I've read in the educational space. I talk about that. It's like you can have a movie on in the background. You can't have a book on in the background.
Yes.
You're either moving it forward with you're the motive power. You're the energy behind the book. There's no, I'm sure people are drowsy and they kind of zone out with, did I just read a panel? That's a different situation. But almost all the time, if it's moving forward, you're powering it.
Right. And also, when you're reading a comic, just like when you're reading a book, you can go back.
Right.
When you're watching a movie, it's like, you sneeze, and like, what? I missed that thing, or you go take a whiz or something, sorry, you got to wait till it's on the DVD. You're not gonna. What happened? What did that person say? And so that's another thing. And if your brain is my experience is that if you are not a reader by the time you're a teenager, it's hard to get into that rhythm. It's hard to get into that, to access and to enjoy that, you having to row the boat, so to speak, because you're so used to media being pushed at you, right? You're a spectator, not a precipitant, right? You're not participating in the game. You're just a spectator. You're just sitting there and watching it. And I think as we go forward, that's going to be a big issue for a lot of visual storytellers, especially people in print. If you have a significant amount of your audience that is also used to reading webcomics.
And I think that will be a great place to stop. We are exactly at the 10 o'clock mark. Michael Manley, I want to thank you for your service.
Well, thank you guys.
I don't know if you saw, Mike, on the screen, the little banner that we reached 1,000 subscribers.
Oh, we got to get the pop champagne cork.
Yes. All right.
So the telethon is over.
Great news.
The telethon is over. We reached our goal.
That's right. So thank you, everybody. We've reached 1,000 subs.
Now we're going to get Dean and Jerry back together again.
And I think this was a really interesting conversation tonight. We will be back next week with a guest. We are going to have Sean Damian Hill on. Sean is a fantastic comic illustrator who's doing really great work. I believe he has a series at Marvel right now. I think he's doing Bishop something. Sorry, I'm tired. But yeah, he's doing like a mini series with a really cool Bishop storyline.
And I want to say that in future episodes, if there's some subject matter that you guys are interested in, that you would like one of us or all of us to cover, really, write us, let us know. I mean, I'm just, coming up with the stuff off the top of my head, but there may be some thing that you're really curious about, or you'd like to explore more or have a conversation about. And I think that's the great thing about this podcast, is it's very liquid and open that way.
Yeah. And I think you've already seen the show get curated in ways because people said, "Hey, why don't you get some editors or somebody on here?" And we had that great conversation with Joe Illich. So we do listen to you guys. So don't be the silent majority. Why don't you speak up? All right, thanks, you guys. We're over time. Please come in. Oh, hold on. James says he's loving your time lapse videos, Mike.
Oh, thanks.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Oh,
Thank
and are you turning the comments off in your when you post those because people can't comment? That might just be a box.
Yeah, I think the comments. I'll have to go and see if I can turn the comments back on. I think I had turned them off because there was like spam in there or something.
Okay, yeah, and we can always monitor that. All right, JRD says, I don't know where you're going with this. How about adapting work to comics with a focus on ending each page with a cliffhanger? JRD. Oh, Shelly says a talk about color would be cool. And we've had color conversations before. I remember early when we got on to YouTube, we had Rico Renzi on. He's a fantastic colorist. Also, his name is all over the Spider-Verse movie. And you should go back in the archives and watch that. We had a really deep conversation about color. But yeah, we can always go back to that. I'm really excited. So, all right, you guys, we got to switch gears. Us cartoonists got to get back to work. So thank you so much. Right? It never ends. So thank you guys so much. Thanks for thousands of subs.
Yes.
And,
yay, 1,000.
Yay.
Now let's go for 2.
That's right. Yeah, we'll get that tomorrow. So as we sign off, I will tell all of you, and as you know, yes, James, you know what's up. We are still in a pandemic, so make sure that you wash those Kirby hands.
And put them inside a traditional grid layout.
I just like, each one of our boxes is like nice rectangular.
Pause. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.
Bye.
1,000.